So I want to show you something. Yeah. Um, this is a React website. Gonna go right here. See this? This is my 4.4 page, right? Where my React app routes to. If there's no, if the path here doesn't match any component or page route, yeah? So that's my 4.4 page, okay? Now I want to show you something. If I navigate to any component that I know exists, for example, a dashboard here, this happens to be a protected route, so you need to be, authenticated to access it. But I want you to see what happens when I navigate to it, right? So it's a split-second thing, so you have to, be really keen to catch it. So now we get to that page. You see what just happened? So let's do that again. For a split second, you actually see my 4.4 page. Yeah, this 4.4 page. Before I actually get rerouted to the home page, because that's a protected route, you actually see my 4.4 page, right? For a split second, yeah, and then I get routed. Now, why is that happening? Okay, go to our developer tools, okay, and we can actually see it here in my console, yeah, that no routes match wherever I'm routing to, yeah. Now, the reason why this is happening is because my dashboard, okay, let's go back here to my actual code. My dashboard is a lazy loaded component, okay? So there's code splitting happening here, all right? It means that anytime I navigate to the component, okay, it takes a while before the router can actually identify it, which leads to this error. Can actually resolve that route because it's loading lazily, right? So I get this error before that component actually resolves. So the reason why that's happening, right, is because of, the lazy API from React, right? Or we can go to its implementation here, and you actually get to see that it returns a promise. Of course, right? As it should, it returns a promise. So when that component is loaded, for example, if I have deployed this website, your page could take a while to load because of, something like your server, how long your server takes to respond, the network that you're on, and many other factors that could, delay how long that component takes to load. And so because of that, it has to be a promise, right? Makes sense. And if you read the documentation here, you see that let's actually go to the, let's see, let me just, I want to go to the React docs for this. And here we go. Yeah. This is the documentation for lazy loading API. Yeah. See how you implement it. And there's a mention of suspense here, which I'll just get to in a moment. Now, how can we, resolve this? Yeah. So as I was looking around for solutions, I happened to come across, like a solution here, which felt very hackish, but, using the component did mount, component did catch lifecycle hook, right? For React class components, you can use that to catch if there was an error with a loading state of the component. Yes. Now, this, again, the implementation for this would be that in our component here, as we route to it, right, we just add this fallback, which would be our 404 page, right? Which is what would render, right? If our state has an error, okay, then we would return this fallback, right? You can see here coming from the props, and the fallback is right here, which is our 404 page. So this is what would render, right? If there's an error, if it has an error, we render the 404 page. Now, I've already implemented this, right? As you can see on the classroom dashboard route, right? That part, I've already implemented this, right? It's an error boundary. If you go back to the documentation on lazy loading, you'll see that in the documentation, they do specify that if this promise rejects, React will throw the rejection reason for the nearest error boundary to handle. So what do we do? What we're trying to solve here is we don't want that page to show, right? Because it's a weird user experience, right? If you're trying to load a page and then for a split second you see that, and then you see the actual page you're trying to render, right? You see, it can look a bit odd. Like you can see here, the message for page not found takes a while before it shows on the page. But I want you to assume that you have a page that the error shows immediately, right? I'm gonna go back to a version of my page here that shows this error instead. Okay, so this is just a different design. And what you notice happens now is if I go to my dashboard, I see page not found for a split second. Okay, let's do that again. I see page not found, and then I get routed where I'm supposed to go, right? Now, the only reason why I wasn't seeing it before, the page is loading, the 404 page is loading. But the only reason why I wasn't seeing it before is because in the new design, right, that the error itself takes a moment before it shows on the page, right? Okay. Let's do that again. Page not found, right? So there's an animation attached to it. So if I navigate to my actual page right now, I do see the 404 page, but I don't see the error page not found. But if you had a different design, you would see it, right? So I would not, it's not, you can't just say that you're going to design your 404 page in a way that error is not technically shown for a second, right? As we are doing here, I feel like that's a optimal solution for that kind of problem, right? So does React give us a solution to this? No, and that's my issue. Because if you go to this component did catch solution here, I want you to realize that this is technically, it only gets triggered if the component throws an error. Yeah, but our component isn't throwing an error. The classroom dashboard page is not throwing an error. There's no error on that page. It's loading lazily. It's a promise, right? So it has to have some sort of fulfilled state or a rejected state. But React doesn't give us any intuitive way of, accessing that state. So what we end up with this kind of behavior. Because if you were to think about something like this did catch lifecycle hook. Okay, if I go back here to my application, they did catch error states, right? If I was to turn it to true for my error boundary, then I would see the error and a fallback UI here and the error that it returns. Okay, so this only occurs if there's an error in the component. Okay, doesn't just show up, right? But my component doesn't have an error. It's only that it's taking a while before it loads, right? So this is a suboptimal. In fact, it doesn't work, right? This component did catch lifecycle hook doesn't work. Why? because it's listening for an error on the component, but the component isn't throwing an error, right? It's just taking a while to load because this is a promise, right? So this solution here, okay, technically doesn't work, right? So what does that leave us with? I can just get rid of that solution altogether. Okay, so just get rid of this error boundary that we've implemented. Okay, we don't need it because it's not gonna work. It's not that the component is throwing an error, it's just that it's taking a while to load. Okay, so we get rid of that altogether. Yeah, let's see. Great. So let's try something different. All right. Now, since React doesn't give us any way of tapping into the, the return, the fulfilled state of this promise, right? Whether it's a rejection or it actually fulfilled successfully, right? We need to basically come up with our own solution of how we can resolve that issue, because we don't want our users seeing this. Okay, every time you are navigating to a component, you see the 4.4 page for a moment, and then you see whatever page you need to see, right? Because the component is still loading. So one solution I implemented was on the 4.4 page itself, right? I could create a delay before the page loads, right? So for example, I could create a timeout here. Okay. I'm gonna use the use ref hook. Okay. So I can clear this timeout later. So timeout. Current. Ignore the TypeScript errors for now. So timeout current. It's gonna be a timeout. Let me give it a timeout of like 5 seconds. Okay. And then I'm gonna create a state here, right? Like a show state. Okay. And then I'm gonna say it's gonna initialize as false. And then in my timeout, I'm gonna set the state to true, right? After 5 seconds. Okay. Set show to true. All right. And then also set the state to false when my component unmounts with this return here, right? So this is the 4.4 page technically, right? And then I'm gonna come here, take my state, put it on my 4.4 page. Okay, so for example, just right here, render my 4.4 page conditionally. Okay. Yeah, I think it should be right there. So the entire page will render conditionally. Okay, so I'm gonna set show here. Set my page to render conditionally like that. Let's see. Some kind of error with okay, let's do this again. Yeah, so I'm gonna just put it inside of this React fragment so that the return is returning a JSX component. Okay. Yeah, and now I need to wrap this inside of another fragment because I'm returning, right, this component and this component. So I'm gonna just wrap the end of my div here with that closing fragment tag. Just like that, and the error goes away. So now I'm gonna render my component conditionally, right? And what's happening is, let me space this out so it's a bit clear. I'm creating a timeout. Okay, after 5 seconds, I set the show state to true, which I've initialized it as false. And then if the component unmounts, I set it back to false. And the other thing I want to make sure that I've done, which is why we use the use ref here, is make sure that when my component unmounts, I am also clearing that timeout. Yeah, so clear timeout. Okay, just like that. All right, so ignore the squigglies. It's just TypeScript errors, which you're not going to deal with right now because that's beyond the scope of what we're doing. So now let's go back to our website here. I'm gonna try and go to navigate to my Classroom dashboard, and now I do not see that 404 page. As my component is rendering, I don't see my that 404 page. Okay, I don't see the 404 page. And even if I go to a UI a route that doesn't exist, you can see there's a delay before the 404 page shows. Okay, so give it a second, like 5 seconds, and then you see the 404 page, which means if I go to a page that does exist, right, I won't see that 404 page. Why? Because of the delay. Now, this works, but again, there's a problem. Why? Again, the page's load time is being determined by factors that you can't technically put a measure to and say that the server is going to take 5 seconds to respond. The page is going to take 5 seconds to load. You technically, there's no way you can determine how long the page is going to take to load. So here it's almost like we are, guessing that this page is going to take 5 seconds to load, but technically we don't know how long it's going to take to load. So this works only when you can effectively estimate how long your page is, your component takes to load. Technically, that's again works, but still a suboptimal solution if you ask me, right? So what's the workaround to this? Okay, we're gonna get rid of that timeout altogether. A solution that does work, but still suboptimal. So I'm gonna get rid of it. Okay. Then we try and find a more intuitive solution, right? So let me just make sure I am removing those hooks that I'm not using anymore, right? So let's go back to our lazy loading API here. Okay. So it states here that if the promise rejects, React will throw the rejection reason for the nearest error boundary to handle. All right, that's one thing. But if you go to the documentation, okay, let's go to the documentation for the lazy loading API. Okay, somewhere around here, they do mention that now that your component's code loads on demand, you also need to specify what should be displayed while it's loading. So you can do this by wrapping the lazy component or any of its parents in a suspense boundary. Okay, so suspense is what is going to show before the component loads. All right, so the component is loading asynchronously. So before the component resolves, right, whether it loads or throws an error, while we are in that waiting state, right, the suspense component, what you supply to this suspense boundary, the fallback component you supply here, right, is what is going to show. So in my case, I have, let's go back to my code here. I have my suspense here. Okay. And my suspense is a backdrop. It's just a loading UI. Okay. So that's why if you go to the page, right, every time I'm loading something, you see this loading UI, right? So we can actually force it to force the loading state. So we can actually see it a bit better. Okay. Click on this page. So I'm gonna suspend the component so we can see the loading state, right? Okay. So here I'm using React Developer Tools. Okay. So yeah, as you can see, this is the backdrop. This is just the fallback component that I'm using. All right. In my suspense here. Okay, which shows wait. So as the component waits to load, this is what the user will see, right? But in our case, they're not just seeing this, they see that and the 4.4 as well, right? And of course, they're seeing the 4.4 because the router doesn't yet know that that component exists because it's yet to load. So for a split second, the router is going to think the component doesn't exist. And then when the promise resolves, then it shows you the actual page that you want to see. So what can we do, right? The other thing I, thought of doing to resolve this problem is because I have that fallback component, then what I can do, all right, is, let me see, my backdrop here is I have this layout hook, okay? So again, I just chose to use the layout hook because I wanted whatever I'm implementing in this hook to execute immediately, as soon as possible, because use layout will, execute synchronously, meaning immediately the component starts to render, but the use effect will only take effect after the component has mounted. And I don't want it to this, whatever I'm implementing here, to work only after the component has mounted. I want it to work immediately, right? So let me just clean this a bit, right? Just to make it a bit more clear, right? Some of this isn't quite necessary for me to demonstrate what I want to demonstrate. So as you can see here, all I was doing is I wrap my 4.4 with a div and give the div an ID, right? So wrap the 4.4 page with a div, give it an ID of 4.4 page, and then come here, get that ID, get that element with an ID, all right? So as my component is mounting, immediately it starts to mount, the display property of my 4.4 page, I hard code it to none. And then after this backdrop, right, that loading UI has been unmounted, I revert back to a display of flex. You can either put flex or box, just a preference there. Block or flex, right? So basically what I'm saying here is, as long as my backdrop is showing, I do not want my 4.4 page to show as well. Again, I'm doing that also for copyright why here, so we can just get rid of that because it's just doing the same thing. But basically what I'm saying here is, as long as my backdrop is still showing, which is the loading state of the fallback for the loading state of the component, then I do not want my 4.4 page to show, right? Now, this is more intuitive and more efficient in the sense that, as opposed to using a timeout, here, I don't know how long this backdrop will last. How long my component will take to load. It can take 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds, right? For different circumstances, right? But as long as my backdrop is still showing, right, my 4.4 page will not show, right? So this is more efficient in the sense that no matter how long the component takes to load, the 4.4 will not show for the entirety of that time, as opposed to 5 seconds, because if my component takes more than 5 seconds to load, then at some point, the user will see the 4.4 after 5 seconds, and then the 4.4 will continue to display for as long as the component takes to load. So if the component takes 10 seconds to load, after 5 seconds, my 4.4 page will start to display again in the background, and then for the next 5 seconds, the user will see the backdrop and the 4.4, meaning the user might be confused to think that the page they're navigating to doesn't exist because the 4.4 is only supposed to show when the page does not exist. But in this case, it's not that the page doesn't exist. It exists. It's just that it's still in the loading state, right? So this is more effective in the sense that as long as the backdrop is showing, the 4.4 component will not show. And we can test this if you go back to our website and you go to navigate to that dashboard, you can see I don't see that 4.4. I don't see it, right? So here it is. And now if I go to my dashboard, I don't see it, it's hidden, right? So this is probably the most effective solution I could find. Now, my question is, does this seem intuitive to you? Right? So what is at some point in the future, someone changes this ID to something else, right? Then my implementation here stops working because I'm fetching that component with this ID. I'm not even using a useref, because again, if I was to use useref here and pass that as a prop, that again is a very complex solution to this, right? So I just fetch the component with I just assign it an ID, right? And, pass it here as an ID, right? Fetch it as using the element using the ID. But again, does this seem intuitive for you, right? For me, it still doesn't. It works, but it doesn't, right? So using component did catch, right, won't work, because component did mount, component did update, component did catch. All these lifecycle hooks, there's none that addresses the state of a React component being in the loading state. Not that it has thrown an error, it's still in the loading state. There's no hook for that in React. And this is the issue I wanted to, raise, that can the React team actually work on a more intuitive solution for this? Can you get a hook that actually deals with this issue? Because the fact that I am forced to use this sort of hackish approach doesn't feel very intuitive for me. I just wanted to, what's that here, right? This doesn't feel very intuitive for me. If we had some kind of React lifecycle hook, right? Other than component did catch, because again, this is not going to do anything because it's not that the component is throwing an error. If we had a different hook that, allows us to, track the state of our component loading, so that while our component is in the loading state, I could have just come here, right? And maybe use that hook to dynamically show or hide my 404 page. So if it's in the loading state, if it's fulfilled, then and only then do I show my 404 page, to avoid the issue that you're seeing on the UI right now, right? Because even use effect, right, will only works when the component mounts, when the component updates, and when the component unmounts, right? There's no component loading state even for the use effect hook, right? And even for same case for class components, there's no component did. I don't know what it would be called, or maybe component is loading hook, right? But all I wanted to say is that we need this hook, right? Because as it stands, the only solution I could find for this is implementing something like this, which again feels very hackish and not intuitive to me. All right, so you'll have a good day. If someone else has a better solution to this issue, I am very open to hearing it, right? And if there's some kind of solution or some hook that exists that I can use to solve this issue, right, I would really appreciate some feedback on this. But if there exists no solution for this, then the React team needs to work on a solution for this.